All right, so composing levels, composing spaces. Let's go ahead and get in on like how do we do that? How do we set things up? Let's imagine sort of a hypothetical arrangement of spaces. Um, sort of a this is not necessarily to scale. It's not necessarily to the size of these spaces. It's more of a hierarchy of dependency, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But what I'm mapping out here is sort of spatial dominance. In this case, we sort of have this dominant center area, maybe some sort of like courtyard area, and we have these spaces that are sort of dependent off of it. Let's call this space a spatial cluster. So essentially a couple of spaces that are sort of clustered together, and a cluster is sort of a loose definition. It's and it could be that in the overall level structure, we sort of have sort of a structure, a spatial cluster here, and then we have a number of spatial clusters that are sort of around it, and there may be a lot of connectivity, even more connectivity than here, but essentially what kind of defines a spatial cluster would be that it's an area that has an identity of its own. You understand that this space sort of is separate in identity. It's separate than basically the spaces around it. Second, that it's a place that has a shared purpose. So both in the sort of I guess world building sort of space, like who actually built this space, but mostly in a gameplay space. And I want you to think about whenever you're creating level spaces and your levels, each space that you create, think about what is the purpose of this space, what is the purpose of this spatial cluster. And a spatial cluster is sort of a number of spaces that sort of work together in a singular purpose. And then third, spatial cluster, there's circulation between them. So you're moving back and forth between spaces within the cluster. If these spaces were like close together, but you weren't able to go back and forth between them, it doesn't really count as sort of a cluster, a space, sort of a macro space, I guess you'd call it. So let's talk about if we were to sit down and design a spatial cluster, which is essentially what the assignment's going to be for this particular week.